What's up guys, my name is XANAA and hi, how's it going? Today I'm gonna be talking a little bit about every Need for Speed game. And that's because this video is mainly targeted at people who have never played a Need for Speed game before, or maybe one, maybe a couple of games, but never really played them a lot and got too invested into the franchise. And so that's what this video is gonna be about. And one more thing I want to mention before we get things started. Throughout the video, my voice is gonna sound a bit more laid back than others, and that just has to do with the sheer length of this project. And so, please leave a like and subscribe. It took me a long ass time to make this video, and it would really help out the channel. So, with that being said, let's get into it! So, where should I begin? For starters, if you already happen to have some Need for Speed games lying around, well, that can have a direct influence on your general taste of what kind of video game you're looking for. Since I obviously have no idea if you already own a copy of any Need for Speed game, I'll be going off the assumption that you've maybe touched a video game before in your life, or maybe you like cars in general. Maybe you've played a racing game or something competitive before, or maybe you grew up with toy cars. I don't know. You could be driving daily for all I know, and so with that, what kind of gameplay are you after? I don't know! Well, if you're more of a casual gamer and you probably bought yourself a new gaming console within the past 5 years, it's probably gonna be one of these. The latest Need for Speed games that you could play on these consoles would be Need for Speed Rivals, 2015, Payback, Heat, and Hot Pursuit Remastered. Now, all of these are PlayStation 4 and Xbox One games, so you wouldn't be able to play the latest Need for Speed on them, but with the backwards compatibility the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X has, you can play Unbound while still also being able to play the older games. So, what are these games like? It's kind of complicated to describe them. Most people would describe any Need for Speed game as an arcade racer, and so what this means is, you have a game like Outrun or Burnout, where the most of the game's realism is cranked at a solid 10% since no car in real life should ever be able to handle this way. Think of it as how the physics are implemented into the game. Then, in a game like Gran Turismo or Forza, the game's driving physics are trying to simulate how these cars would perform in real life, while still making the entire feel of driving as entertaining as possible. So what does this have to do with Need for Speed? Well, Need for Speed games mostly take that arcade approach, but to a pretty comfortable level. They are often action-packed games with a ton of stuff happening all at once. Most of that stuff being police chases and illegal street racing. If we want to go back to the core roots of Need for Speed, we'd have to look back at the older games. Now, this isn't me saying I encourage you to play the older Need for Speed games, since you'd really have to go out of your way to legally play them nowadays. Wait! None of these games have been distributed on modern software, but I've done full reviews of these games on this channel, talking about them into depth. But to sum the first few games up, yeah, they're okay. The concept of the first few Need for Speed games is pretty bare bones, but mostly maintaining focus about illegally driving with the most exotic racing cars at the time. And sometimes there will be cops and you have to avoid not getting busted while also still winning the race. Need for Speed games would become mostly known for always having cop car chases, since no other games around this time could really do it that well. And so around that time, Forza wasn't birthed yet, and Gran Turismo only had its first game recently come out, which was a much bigger success. And so naturally the only way to come back from this was to copy all the elements from the third game and slap a career mode onto it. So what we ended up getting is nothing short from driving more exotic cars and hearing the police sirens. There are a few more PlayStation 1 Need for Speed games, but the only other one that somewhat relates to this game would be Porsche Unleashed. Now, what this thing has going on for it is, it's again mainly a career mode, and you only get to drive iconic Porsches from the 40s to the then present day 2000. You go through the career mode by buying various vehicles for each required event to beat, and its career is split into 3 different eras. There is a pursuit mode in the game, but it's only locked behind a free play mode, and so you'll likely just play it once and then be like, yeah, it's okay. I think your primary objective in this game would just be collecting cars, beating the campaign, and that's it. And then we have Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2. Now what I will say is, if you've played the other classic Need for Speed games and then you come to this, you'll realize Need for Speed has come a long way since and it's now in the clear. I'd say this game is fantastic if the classic Need for Speed games interest you. This game, whilst it also has a campaign mode, I'd say the core gameplay element again lies within the pursuit mode, and this time it's at its best. More than ever do all the vehicles from the previous games shine in this one, since, well, there was a 2-year difference between this and Porsche Unleashed. It might not have a career mode with a currency system like in High Stakes or Porsche Unleashed, but in terms of actual gameplay, this game is by far the most relentless Need for Speed has ever felt like, and that is an addiction in itself. And for a while, that would be it in terms of just turning on the game and getting straight into the action. Now, there is Most Wanted 05 and games that follow after that, but those games I'd consider a step above the classic Need for Speed games, if anything. As such, I'll be categorizing each game in some way or another, so you kinda get the idea what Need for Speed games there are. So far, I've only touched the classic Need for Speed games, and the best way I would describe them is as simple arcade racers. You start up the game, you select a car, and then enter an event, and that's it. Another game that fits perfectly into this category would be Need for Speed Nitro. So this is gonna be a very hard sell since it's the only Wii exclusive, but again, main menu, world thing with elements, select a car and race. You have an in-game currency and you can buy cars, you can customize them and then race them. You get into a race and the overall feel of the game is really arcadey and there are cops. It all does sound very been there and done that, but every event has a total amount of stars to obtain, which you earn from doing certain challenges during a race. It's all very simple, but it fits right within the older Need for Speed games, and it's a game I actually kinda really like. Now hear me out. I'd also say Hot Pursuit 3 sort of falls into this camp, since you have your main menu, then you have this world map and you pick either a racer event or a cop event. When you select an event, you choose a car and you get into the action. Now for me personally, the start of this game is a bit bland and very sluggish, so to say, but later on when you start driving the faster cars, the entire feel of the game overall becomes a better experience. I do still think that breakthrough drifting feels kind of odd and with the overall physics and feel of the game. And there is free roaming in this game, but I'm still playing this on my Xbox 360, so there's not a lot of stuff here. I don't know if this map should be filled out with other people or gamer tags or people to challenge, but there is nothing here at all when I drive around all over the place. But that doesn't take away from the gameplay. Yeah, I'd say this game is overall pretty solid, but not for me. Now, another game that's kinda similar to Hot Pursuit would be Need for Speed Rivals. This I personally find to be a very difficult game to categorize anywhere, since I think it's kinda similar to Hot Pursuit we just played, but it's still relatively different. When you start up the game, you just get put into your garage and you have a map with tons of different events to play. And you can also just leave the garage and drive up to any accessible events. It's again just your basic enter an event, race the AI, and at some place within the event you'll trigger the cops into chasing you. When you beat that race, the cops will carry on chasing you until you actually evade them, and this completely gets on my tits. Just mainly because of the overall feel and controls of the game. I'd say this is probably a Need for Speed game that has the least arcadey feel to it ever. Maybe they were going for realism. I'd say the most frustrating this game ever gets is accidentally using your turbo power up, crashing into a wall and then having to sit there waiting for the crash cam to be done. I absolutely can't stand it, and there's no way to turn it off. Now, this game was mostly worked on by Criterion but finished by Ghost. In fact, the last Need for Speed game we looked at was also a Criterion game, so I think that makes it right for me to also take a look at Most Wanted 2012 next. So, this game, where should I even start? Now, first off, I thought about ranking these three games together and making them a part of a confused era of Need for Speed racers, but I think Hot Pursuit 2010 and Need for Speed Rivals don't quite belong there anymore. When you strip away any kind of story or a goal with an objective, any kind of car customization, or really any sort of gimmick that makes it stand out from the rest, you're really just left with Most Wanted 2012. Now listen up, I'm aware that the classic Need for Speed games didn't really have in-depth story or long, deep, full-fledged career modes. I'm aware that at its core, they are simple racing games about just doing illegal street racing and having to outrun the cops or whatever. That's why I've ranked them as simple arcade racers. If I stay true to my heart, I still think Rivals is its own thing. It's a pretty decent racing game. It has a career mode, the world looks fantastic, there is car customization, and there is also a cop career mode. I think this game is something kinda like a simple arcade Need for Speed racer, but also turned into something much more to try and simulate realism in racing. Most Wanted 2012 really has nothing. What you're looking at is basically what you're getting. You get to drive all kinds of different cars, you have to obtain a gold rank with each event that car has available, and you get a little upgrade, I guess. You can only change the car color by driving through a petrol station. The police are kinda brain dead. The physics, they're just fine, I guess. And the overall feel of the game when you're driving, I mean, it's all functioning, and that's really all I can describe about it. You have a car, and with that car you complete a checklist of events to beat, and when you win, you earn SP. And there is a Most Wanted list, and when you pass someone on that list with SP, you can challenge them and win that car. That's really the only incentive to play, I guess. Now, unless you pay for all the DLC and play it constantly online, if you played this game without ever updating it and just played it offline, only then you get a very simple game that seems just like a failed MMO, if anything. And I haven't even talked about the original Most Wanted yet, but okay, this game I'd recommend people only play if they find a really cheap copy of it, and or if you're really curious, and otherwise, yeah, don't bother playing this. Right, so I've talked about the basic, simple arcade Need for Speed entries, as well as, oh god, what is this? And now I'm gonna be talking about the tuner open world era of Need for Speed entries. You were probably waiting for when I was going to mention these, but after Hot Pursuit 2 was a pretty decent success, they made Need for Speed Underground, the most successful Need for Speed for its time. Now, there isn't any free roaming in this game, but the car tuning and the gameplay makes more than up for it. The game's Underground mode is essentially just a very simple event select menu with the objective of you to become rank number 1 in every event. But there is always variety within this menu of events you can play here, and customizing your car in this game was the huge gimmick. Creating this monster and then taking it out on the streets and seeing it on magazine covers, it's just a really cool concept. Not to mention, if you're all about Japanese tuner cars, this game is just a few cars shy of having a Japanese cars only car roster. Now, the overall feel of the controls, while they are arcadey, my main issue most of the time is just not being able to see very well. That with a combination of this game likes being a jerk about spawning in traffic cars when you least expect it, but outside from that, this is a pretty solid game, even though I wish there were cops. But that's my only gripe. Then naturally they made a sequel to this game a year later called Need for Speed Underground 2. It's a similar game, but this time everything is open world and you have to drive to the events. The events do range of similar types, but the car roster has been expanded on to include more American and European cars. The objective is once more become the face of Bayview and win over as many sponsors as possible so you can see your cars featured in magazines. The overall feel of the gameplay can be described as the first Underground game, but a bit less slippery and ironed out more. But that's all about to change. So, this is the Most Wanted everyone loves and is familiar with. First off, it takes a more grittier approach with its visuals and its overall presentation. I mean, could you tell? Most 1.5 takes the concept of there being a blacklist, with your objective being the most notorious street racer there is. Throughout the game, you'll be doing all sorts of events mandatory to beat along with milestone events. These are events that, in this instance, I'm meant to be tagging 35 cop cars, but the challenges range from escaping in a certain amount of time or causing a total amount of overall damages dealt to destroying properties in cop cars. On top of that, some of the customization elements from the Underground games were carried over to this one, and might I just say that everything really works well together in this game? It's not exactly as over the top in terms of tuning like the last two games, but that isn't even the focus of this game. Its focus is to have brutal cop chases, which, with a combination of its difficulty, makes for a very addictive experience. Now, to briefly talk about the controls, it does feel a little understeerish at times, but overall the controls are pretty perfect, and again, it's entirely open world. I recently made a video where I'm playing through this game but with a dance mat. The link for that is going to be in the description, and it'd be cool if all of you checked it out. And then we go to the next game. Need for Speed Carbon starts off with where you finish most 1.5. It's basically a direct sequel, and the only time we really get something like this. This time we go to Palmont City, where our objective is simply being the club that rules over all the territories. There are 4 main areas, as you can see, and with your own club, you just have to keep beating the events until you take down each boss from that territory. It's pretty basic storytelling. There aren't that many changes to the controls other than that it still feels slippery at times, but you just gotta get the hang of it. There is a lot less gameplay really involving pursuit, but there is cops, and there is also a challenge series involving cop missions. And the tuning once again is an overall improvement. What I just really like about it is its general presentation and just how stunning everything still looks for a 16-year-old game. And I've really come around to loving this game. Then the next game that came out was Need for Speed Pro Street. But I'm not gonna be talking about Pro Street yet. Instead, I'm gonna be talking about one of my favorite things on this channel. Need for Speed Undercover. Okay, so Need for Speed Undercover. I'm 5 pages deep. This is a game that got itself so many different releases, but the two I'll be talking about are the 6th gen and 7th gen versions. So this is the 7th gen version. It's just kind of fine. The controls feel pretty arcadey, and that's the only praise I can really give this game. It's again a racing game with events you have to pass in order to progress the story. And in this game, you're an undercover cop and you have to take down criminals. The story and the entire concept of this game are pretty poorly executed. I mean, you go from doing a few street races to then doing driver jobs, and I don't know. The pacing should have just been better, and well, the decent thing about this game is that it again had decent car tuning. But once more, the game goes for a gritty, apocalyptic art style. This is fine, but if you find out about the entire development process behind this game, you'll find out how and why this is the final product. Now, go to Coloursheds' video about Need for Speed Undercover, because he goes into more depth on that overall development of the game. But for me, this game is fine. A one and done sort of deal. The events are fine, the pursuit is fine, but it's no better than the previous games. But that leads me to the 6th gen Undercover game. As you might tell, I sorta have a problem. I really like this game, and it's essentially just a ROM hack of most 1.5, but officially licensed. Now, as a licensed product, yeah, the quality is unacceptable. It's shocking at times. There is a lot of asset reusing, there is no blacklist, and so the career follows a similar narrative to the other Undercover. You do a bunch of races and then the occasional driver job. What I've always loved about this game though is simply just the controls. It's a bit arcadey, but to perfection in my opinion. It's also just really fast and responsive. It's a game that ultimately takes about 5 hours to complete, but for me it's just such a fun and entertaining game, and that's what matters most about games, whether they are fun or not. Then we're gonna have to fast forward to a few years, since the games that came out we've already covered. So the year is 2015. Criterion is no more. Ghost has been in charge with making the 2015 Need for Speed game. And this is what we got. So, is what most people remember of this game, but okay, let's lay the basics. first and foremost, once more we have an open world Need for Speed game, and there's this group of people who all want to do stuff with you. But you can also just do whatever you please. This game, I think, to this day, is still one of the best looking Need for Speed games. There is just something about driving around this Los Angeles type of open world at night. This game's entire aesthetic is just super pleasing to me. But okay, once more we have very simple racing and drifting events, and there is a pursuit system. Now, it's not very good, but for someone playing it when they start the game, they might have a small challenge, I guess. Yeah, cops were just too easy in this game, but how do the controls feel? Well, that's also really difficult to describe, but it feels as if there is maybe a slight delay based off what inputs you do, steering being the main one. Play this for yourself. It's really difficult to describe how the controls feel. Maybe it's me, but I wish it felt a bit more responsive. And then there's also Brake to Drift. I don't really care for it personally. It's a bit wonky at times, but overall I do really enjoy revisiting this game. Then 2 years later we got Payback. Now this is a game I sort of have a huge problem with. On surface level, this looks like a game that basically builds on top of the 2015 structure and foundation. But now it's all completely open world. We're in this Las Vegas-esque world, and I think this totally works for the type of game this wants to be, but I really don't like what kind of game it tries to be. So we have a bunch of different game types throughout the game, just regular racing, which I don't even think there is enough of in this game. Then there are these drift trials. Online, these are a bit more fun since there's actually a multiplier depending on the position you're in, but offline it's just this, yeah. Then there is drag racing, and yeah, that was it. There's time trial events, boohoo. Then there are these courier missions. It's usually just go somewhere and wait to collect something. And then there's off-road events, and yeah, I'm absolutely not a fan of these. Now throughout the career, yes, it's all mixed up. There are occasional driver jobs where I just need to do a specific thing. It triggers like a story mode event with the most Hollywood-ass events happening during a race. Then there is also just too much story, in my opinion, within the first 10 minutes at least. You start the game, it's all just story, very little driving, and I just don't care about any of it. I think this game force feeds it into your mouth too much. But anyway, the gameplay is still pretty similar with like a weird, hard to explain delay to when you move. But Pursuit is fine for what it is, maybe a bit more challenging compared to 2015, and the gameplay is genuinely repetitive. And then we have Need for Speed Heat. Now to this day, I still have somewhat mixed feelings on this game, and I still don't really know how to even feel about it after all this time. So let's take a deeper dive into what this game is. So, it's once more open world. You can drive around to do some events, and then once in a while something story driven will happen, depending on the level you are. And then you do some more events. The controls are, again, just fine, nothing that particularly stands out. You have basic events like just street racing, drift trials, which is just this. And then there are these off-road races, which, yeah, it's cool, I guess. This time they aren't required to do in order to progress the story, which I really like. Throughout the story, you'd occasionally be, again, doing some kind of driver job type event that touches on the story. I don't really remember any of them other than that there's one where you have this white Ferrari F40 and something, yeah. And the gameplay is, again, similar to Payback in 2015. It's inoffensive, and to this day, I still don't really know what to think of this game. The pursuit system is alright, and cop chases are a genuine blast to play. And the tuning is its best it's been since the past 9-10 games. What makes this such a big deal is the fact you're able to engine swap certain cars. On some of them, it doesn't really make a huge performance difference, but on other vehicles, it just might. This game also introduced us to character customization. You just pick your dude and you dress it up a little bit. The player character isn't involved with the story like in Payback, and instead in this game you are more of a spectator that does get involved directly with some of the action. And then, to leave it on a high, the overall world still looks incredible. The world setting, although there is still not a day and night cycle, it's still beautiful to drive around. And then that leaves us to the most recent game, Need for Speed Unbound. I still even haven't beaten this game. I've been playing it on and off, but honestly it just feels like Heat, but with all of its best elements reused. Once more, the gameplay, I'd say, is even better and more action-packed, but it's all still kinda samey like Heat from there on out. The tuning is better, pursuit is a bit better, and the story is a similar narrative. But other than that, yeah, it's a Need for Speed game. It's a decent experience nonetheless. So, like Heat, but better is how I would currently describe this game. And with that, we still have a few games left to cover. Pro Street, Shift 1, and Shift 2. Let's start with Pro Street. So, Pro Street came out at around a very interesting time. This was the mid-2000s, when Need for Speed was still at a relatively all-time high, with Most Wanted 05 and Underground reaching fantastic sales markets. And Carbon to most people wasn't quite what it lived up to be, so people were very eager to see what would have come out next. And it's a Need for Speed game that does racing in closed environments. Now, this is due to real-life events happening around this time, discouraging racing altogether at all costs, so they made a game that doesn't promote street racing and all of this stuff. So what we have here is a game that tries to blend arcade physics together with real-world physics, and so the overall feel of this game I'm completely torn on. I still haven't exactly spent many hours playing this game and properly finishing it, but I think I would like all what's here better if I enjoyed the overall feel of driving just better. You have basic racing events with a few others to spice the racing up. There is a time attack, you can guess what this is by now. There is sector shootout, and it works like this. There is drag racing, and it's actually pretty fun. There is drifting, and I can't drift for shit in this game. There is speed challenge, you drive really fast on a public autobahn, and then top speed run is you have to pass a checkpoint with as high of a speed as possible. Overall, I'd say the game isn't offensive to me or anything. I'd love to play this properly for a review video someday. But do you want to know what game does everything this game has, but just better? Race Driver Grid. Now, this isn't a grid review, I'm merely trying to talk about every Need for Speed game ever in less than 30 minutes, but it is a game that really nails what this game tries to go for. 2 years later, with a different development team, EA let another team take a stab at it with this closed racing environment stuff. So, Need for Speed Shift is a game. If you want to race, take it to your local track. Bitch. So yeah, definitely a game. What we have here are some fictional tracks mixed in with some real ones, and while it is all really cool driving and racing on Laguna Seca, again, I really do not enjoy the overall handling of this game. It just feels really strange. It's not going for realism, and it kinda drifts too much away from being a fun and simple to control arcade game. If you like Gran Turismo or Burnout, you're not getting neither out of this game, and you should just play Grid instead. It's just a game I don't really have words for, and it's not for me. Speaking of not for me, Shift 2 is a game. Dirt 2 is also a game. So, the overall feel of this game is that it feels heavy, and I get it, I'm driving a Volkswagen GTI, but the game didn't let me drive anything else despite it saying there are loaner vehicles. It says it right there, but I searched everywhere, and it's hard to let my bias take over this entire video, but that's how opinions and feelings are formed. I don't think this is a fun experience by first impression standards. It does have some seriously cool tracks like Mount Panorama, but it just feels weird. Again, with the handling, it's not pleasing anyone, nor is it really fun. And that leaves us to our final game. So, this is Need for Speed The Run, the last game Black Box worked on, and what we got is a game that is you driving and racing others from San Francisco to New York. It is one giant sprint with sometimes an occasional quick time event. Whilst I do wish it had a few changes, overall I'm happy how everything is done the way it is. And it is a neat little game with great replayability. The steering and controls of the game, again, they don't really lean on the arcade swing of things, and it can feel weird to play this game at times, but this is a fun and simple experience to go play for yourself. And now that I've talked about every Need for Speed game, I'm going to categorize them to the best of my ability. So, the easiest way to categorize the older and more simplistic Need for Speed games I touched on earlier, I'd categorize these as simple arcade Need for Speed racers. I'm also putting Nitro and Hot Pursuit 2010 in here since they follow similar principles. It's a game you start up and you get basic menus that take you straight into the action. I'd say for the first two games, even though they have special edition releases on Windows, just stick to emulating the PlayStation 1 versions, you're not missing out on much. If you own a PlayStation 1 or 2, then I guess you can try hunting down a copy, but it's not worth it in my opinion. Then for Need for Speed 3 and High Stakes, the console and PC releases, while they are fundamentally the same, they're both made with a different physics engine because a different studio made them. Now, the PC releases do get more content and there are a buttload of mods for both games, but again, accessibility isn't the highest for everyone with these games, and so I've already made videos about both these games talking about everything there is. Check these out before thinking about buying these games. Then the Porsche Unleashed console and PC versions are both completely different games from one another, to the point I'd almost count them as two separate games. But they're also both about the exact same thing. I'd say just emulate the PlayStation 1 version. Getting the PC game installed was an absolute nightmare for me. As for these games, I think you won't have a hard time finding copies of these, and they're all pretty great to play. Then I'd say there is the stubborn era of Need for Speed Racers, which are these three games. I think they're okay. Pro Street is the least offensive one to me, which I'd actually love to fully complete, and the two Shift games are just, they're just okay. I get that they were trying to create their little spin-off series following the success of other racing games designed this way, but these games really fell flat. And it's a shame because it can be done right. I mean, yeah, take a look at Grid. Yeah. Now, this is not a really great example, but the two V-Rally games that then had a Need for Speed title slapped on it for marketing reasons, those were two really solid rally games, and ones that were actually really fun to play, despite being something completely different. Yeah, again, if you're really curious, then proceed playing the two Shift games, but they're both frustrating to play, I find. They exist, but they're absolutely not for me. Then there is the tuner open world era of Need for Speed Racers, which consists of Underground 1 and 2, Most Wanted of 5 and Carbon, and both Undercover games I talked about earlier. These are some of the best Need for Speed games out there, and ones you should all at least try once. I think the best experience is when you play them in order of release date, and if you really don't like the 7th gen Undercover, then don't bother finishing it, just move on. And then finally there is the present day open world era of Need for Speed Racers. I really couldn't come up with a better title, but it includes these four games and they all copy similar formulas from one another. Now, these are the newest games that there are out. They have the best accessibility. You can buy these right now and then play them for yourself. And the same also applies for Hot Pursuit 2010 Remastered if you don't want to bother going after buying the original. And, I mean, I really like 2015. Payback, I think, is kind of, well, maybe a one and done kind of situation. I really liked Heat, but I didn't really remember the best parts from it, and I'm still playing Unbound to this day and deciding on how I feel about it. And then lastly, there is the miscellaneous era of Need for Speed Racers. That's what I came up with for these three games, as they were also released back to back from one another. None of them are the same, but I really had to place them somewhere. Need for Speed The Run is a pretty decent game. Most Wanted 2012 you should only really play if you're curious and want to experience the game for yourself. And Rivals is okay. It's a difficult sell, but when you get into the gameplay, that's when it starts becoming somewhat fun, and it's by far the most beautiful game that there is, if not 2015. You made it to the end of the video, huh? Right, so you've made it to the end of the video, and first and foremost, I want to thank you for watching me to this point. I have no idea what would have convinced you to watch a crazed Dutch person ramble about car games for 30 minutes. And I mean, I hope that in some way, shape or form I might have possibly been able to find something that you might have been looking for. I mean, there's plenty of games, after all. So, with that being said, thank you guys all for watching. If you guys enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, and I'm gonna play my favorite Need for Speed game, Grid. So, peace out!